Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on episode 20 of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. Oh boy, so we're picking things up right away. Things sort of ended off on Edward confronting his father. Despite everything that had sort of transpired, Ed's father's oddly cordial, considering Edward had committed a horrible taboo and burned down his house. Oh dear. Wow, this is almost worse than him being angry. He's just sort of disappointed in a weird kind of way. I find it interesting that he's not angry about having his house burned down, but I don't know. He's mysterious in a weird sort of way, so he seems like he might be beyond something like that, especially considering how that last little line he had was sort of humanizing, recognizing the similarities between you and your own son. We've sort of been led to believe that he's not been a very good father, and I guess by all available metrics he really isn't, but it seems at least now that there's some measure of regret or reluctance, rather than just the pure indifference we were originally led to believe. Oh, the plot gets really thick now. Apparently he has not aged a day since when Granny Pinako was a young woman, judging by the woman smoking the pipe in that picture. So this raises all sorts of questions, What precisely is his deal? And considering how we seemingly saw him hanging out with the homunculi, it seems as though there's, in all likelihood, more to him than meets the eye, and probably not in a good way. It's also interesting how he's bringing up his late wife, especially in regards to the corpse that the Elric brothers tried to reanimate. He's indicating that despite all their best efforts, the body was not that of their mother. And that's a really tough pill to swallow, because it makes it seem as though, despite everything they lost, they weren't even they weren't even close. You know, it's not like they were close and screwed up by dint of being children, or by virtue of the whole thing being a doomed effort because, I guess, God says so. You know, it really makes it seem as though, like, they had really screwed the pooch. They weren't even close. It was a doomed venture, and, you know, being crippled is really just insult to injury. You know, I'd imagine it would be better in the sense that it would be easier to cope with the fact that they did everything right, it was just impossible, and thus they had failed, rather than they had just failed, it was possible, but they weren't good enough. At least in my mind, I would prefer the former situation. You know, I did everything right, it just wasn't possible at all. Man, you know, Alphonse has it pretty darn rough in that he's seemingly not even able to sleep. Like, he truly has no, like, human bodily functions, and that's rather nightmarish. I mean, on the one hand, like, congratulations, I guess you have 8 extra hours back every day. But on the other hand, you have to wonder, like, what are the effects of not being able to sleep? So I know with us flesh and blood humans, things generally start to get, like, really bad around, like, the 3-day mark of not being able to sleep. Like, if you well and truly get absolutely no sleep, like, I'm pretty sure you start, like, hallucinating, and, like, once you get to, like, a week, then you start, like, dropping dead. And I feel bad for Ed, you know. He's just tormented by basically all of his failings. And it's rather unfortunate how many he has, and the magnitude of them. I mean, it's not entirely fair to pin some of that stuff on him, but, you know, regardless of what's fair, that's how he feels. So I do find it interesting that the Elric brothers' father seems to be marginally sentimental. It's also interesting that he's sort of warning Pinocchio to get the hell out of Dodge because something's going to go south in Amestris. The way that scene was sort of framed makes it seem like he's going to be doing the horrible thing. Really makes you wonder. I do find it interesting that a lot of the time his eyes are sort of hidden behind the glare off his glasses. You know, it really goes a good ways towards making him seem pretty darn sinister. So at this point, Edward no doubt wants to confirm what he had overheard. You know, was the corpse they buried truly his mother or not? And, you know, in a sense, this is a rather horrible question to get an answer to. Like, I'm not sure there's a good answer, honestly, but at the same time, I can't imagine having knowledge like that hanging over my head and not at least attempting to get an answer. I guess it's kind of fitting that it starts raining while they do this miserable business. This is rather grueling, you know. I feel bad for him, trying to, you know, dig this hole and stopping development while doing so. Like, I'd imagine it's just purely a stress reaction rather than the putrefaction of the corpse. You know, not like that's going to be a particularly rosy experience either. Man, this is like, what, the third separate expulsion, as it were? Can't be puking out much more than bile at this point. And I don't know, this unnerves me a bit because I really dislike vomiting. It's a deeply unpleasant experience in my mind, so, you know, like, that kind of hits hard for me. Alright, so here's the moment of truth. They've managed to get what seems to be a lock of hair. So there we have it. Proof positive. You know, black hair when their mother had brown hair. A femur bone that's too long. Hips that are too narrow, you know. It's simply not their mom, and it's not even particularly close. So, I guess in the mind of Edward, everything had literally all been for nothing, you know. In a cosmic sort of way, I guess it is absurd, you know. You suffered this huge, terrible setback, losing limbs, and it was all for basically nothing. You know, I can't blame him for laughing a little bit, just if only because sometimes you have to laugh to keep from crying. And, you know, crying would seem to be the natural response to something horrible like this. You know, it's interesting that Edward sort of brought up this being a symbol of hope, in that, I guess at the very least, they didn't reanimate their mother just to sort of, like, have her die messily again. Granted, it's not much better in that it was either someone else, or rather an entirely spontaneous creation. You know, that's not good, but it's marginally better. You know, I kind of have to wonder about Edward's reasoning for bringing up this difficult subject. Because I feel like Izumi would not take too kindly. You know, it seems like he's not taking a particularly delicate approach to this. You know, are you sure it was your child that you brought back? Like, that seems, I don't know. It smacks to me that he's saying, like, you didn't really know what you were doing. And I mean, to be fair, that is kind of true, in that no one really knows what they're doing, transgressing in this manner. But I feel like he could have said, you know, Alphonse and I had investigated this, and this turned out to be the case. Could it possibly be the case for you? I mean, maybe I'm nitpicking a little bit. I don't know. I'm just saying personally I wouldn't feel comfortable doing something like that to someone I respect. So the plot's thickening a little bit more in that Pinako, presumably being old, forgot to pass along a message to Hohenheim, so now she was fobbing that off on Edward in case he happens to run into his dad again. I mean, on the one hand, it seems like a monumentally unlikely thing since they seemingly both hate each other. But on the other hand, this smacks of foreshadowing to me. Oh dear. Man, it seems like they really can't get rid of Ling and his cohort. Oh dear. Yeah, so Edward's learning all sorts of unfortunate revelations here. Now I have to wonder about that bit about the homunculus, Ling overhearing that, if that will come back to bite somebody in the posterior, considering how he's so hell-bent on finding a method of achieving immortality, perhaps a homunculus would do. And, Ling being a foreign agent, specifically working at the behest of a foreign government, it seems that he might not have the best intentions for Amestris at heart. That was an interesting little bit of animation right there, how Ed dropped the truth right on Alphonse, and he just sort of, swooned, and his legs kind of gave out from under him. It's interesting that he's a suit of armor, but he still retains that human of a response to something. Man, it's been a while since they sort of brought up Edward being short again. Alright, so it seems like Edward is, for some reason, sort of going back to that whole business about Alphonse being Alphonse. I guess it's because their mother wasn't really their mother. That corpse wasn't her. So, they just sort of have to prove that, it's actually Alphonse. And I guess that makes kind of sense, given that they're presented with actual proof that it might not be the case. Now, this is unfortunately heavy business here everyone's dealing with. So Edward's made an interesting deduction here in that it's the truth that is currently holding on Alphonse's body. And even more interesting, it seems like Alphonse was inside the corpse briefly before dying. I'd forgotten about this. This is really good news in a weird sort of way, in that it means they, aside from crippling themselves, they didn't involve anyone else in their fool's errand. Similarly, Izumi has come to the same conclusion in that the infant that was transmuted could not have possibly been theirs. So, in the end, it's kind of going back to what I was saying. Izumi didn't make a mistake. It was just impossible. And so in that sense, she doesn't have to hold on to the guilt about having, brought her child into the world a second time only to have it die again. I'd imagine that is a burden of guilt well, frankly, absolutely incomprehensible to me. I can't imagine living with something like that. I mean, it's not like true resolution what's going on here, but it seems like everyone's sort of been thrown a bone here. You know, yes, they did fail, but it also could have been worse. And considering how 2 of the 3 people believed on good authority that they were at fault here, you know, it's nice to be absolved of that guilt, at least. You know, that seems to be a running theme here. People who harbor guilt, and who seem to be rather prodigious at harboring guilt. Guilt about things that are deserved, and guilt about things that aren't necessarily deserved. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I might have to talk about this at greater length later about, you know, perhaps the absolution of guilt being a larger theme of this work. I'm gonna have to think on that. There might be something there worth talking about. So, you know, it's interesting that this is coming up again, that Alphonse isn't able to sleep, and that's taken a toll on him. If not physically, then mentally. I mean, I'd imagine it would be rather upsetting to be, as far as he's concerned, the only living creature still alive and awake at this hour. I mean, alive is perhaps, you know, being used a bit loosely, but man, heavy stuff. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.